We are pleased to welcome you to this presentation of the third edition of the book The Foreign Policy of the European Union, published by Bloomsbury Academic. I am Stephan Keukeleire, Jean Monnet Professor at the University of Leuven in Belgium, where I teach the course European Foreign Policy in various master programs.
And I am Tom Delreux. I'm a professor of European politics at the UCLouvain in Louvain-la-Neuve, and I'm also a visiting professor at the College of Europe and at Sciences Po Paris. The aim of these videos is not to give a comprehensive summary of all the chapters of the book, but rather to draw your attention to some of the key points of each chapter, to provide some additional insights, and to point to some recent developments which have been triggered or reinforced by the Russian invasion in Ukraine, by the changing geopolitical context, or by internal developments within the European Union or its member states.
In this video, we focus on one of the main themes of the first chapter of the book, and that is the complex nature of EU foreign policy. Because the EU's foreign policy is not exclusive, it's not all-encompassing, and we also conceptualize it as multifaceted, multi-method and multi-level. And to explain the nature of EU foreign policy, it's important to see that the EU is not a state. And this implies that the EU can only have and develop a foreign policy as far as the member states allow the EU to develop such a foreign policy. And member states never intended to transfer all competences regarding foreign policy to the EU, because they wanted to keep control over the EU's foreign policy, and they also wanted to keep their own national foreign policies. And this also implies that it's only in a limited number of policy fields, like trade, that the EU indeed has exclusive foreign policy competences. And that's also what we explain in several chapters of our book, like chapter 4 and 8. And this non-exclusive and non-all-encompassing foreign policy of the EU has also major implications for our analysis and evaluation of the EU's foreign policy. Because perhaps observers and scholars and journalists might expect that the EU intervenes in all parts of the world, or that the EU develops a foreign policy towards all foreign policy dimensions. But that is not what member states wanted, and that explains also the limitations of the EU's foreign policy.
It's in that context that understanding the multifaceted nature of EU foreign policy is important. Indeed, the way we conceptualize EU foreign policy in the book is that it is composed of four partially interrelated facets, which are also treated in different parts of the EU treaties and in different chapters of the book. And the four facets of EU foreign policy are the Common Foreign and Security Policy, the CFSP. Second, the Common Security and Defense Policy, the CSDP. Third, the External Action. And fourth, the external dimension of internal policies. The first facet, the Common Foreign and Security Policy, is the main platform for the political and diplomatic dimension of EU foreign policy. It's organized in an intergovernmental way, which allows member states to keep control over the CFSP. Also, the second facet, the Common Security and Defense Policy, is organized in an intergovernmental way. The Common Security and Defense Policy is the main platform for launching limited military and civilian crisis management operations. It's based on voluntary contributions by member states. And what is important to understand is that the CSDP is not about the territorial defense of the European Union or about large-scale military offensive actions. Moreover, the fact that the European Union has a CSDP does not mean that the European Union has an army. The third facet of EU foreign policy is external action. External action encompasses the long-standing external policies such as trade, development cooperation, sanctions, humanitarian aid, enlargement, and so on. It's in that facet that the EU has the strongest legal competences, that the EU has substantial financial resources and a strong institutional apparatus to prepare and to implement those policies. The fourth facet of EU foreign policy is the external dimension of internal policies. Nearly all internal policies of the European Union indeed have foreign policy relevance and have an external dimension. The most salient policy fields with an external dimension include, for instance, energy policy. Think about the conflict with Russia or the EU's relation with the Gulf states. External environmental policy, think about the climate change challenge and the EU's ambition to address that challenge and to play a leading role in addressing climate change. Or the external dimension of migration policies, think about the crisis in the Mediterranean or the EU's relations with Africa. What is important to emphasize is that those four different facets of EU foreign policy are or can be complementary and can reinforce each other. But on the other hand, in some cases, they can also contradict or undermine each other. But it's important to emphasize again that the EU's foreign policy is composed of those four facets: CFSP, CSDP, external action, and the external dimension of internal policies.
And Tom already referred to it. The EU has two different policy-making methods: the intergovernmental methods and the community methods. And in CSDP and CFSP, we see that the intergovernmental method is the most important one. What does it mean? It means that member states keep control over policy making. And how do they do that? They organize it through the Council of the EU and through the European Council, where the member states are represented, so they can control policy making. And secondly, decisions are adopted through unanimity. Unanimity is required, which implies that all member states have to agree. The second method is a community method. And the community method, what does it mean? It means, first of all, that not only the Council of the European Union, but also the Commission and the European Parliament do play an important role. Secondly, in the Council of the EU, decisions are adopted through majority voting. And this means that even if 1, 2 or 3 member states don't agree, that nevertheless the decision can be adopted. And thirdly, it also implies that the Court of Justice has jurisdiction over these policy fields. And in the treaties, there's a clear difference between the two methods, the intergovernmental method and the community method. But it's important to see that in practice, for most important policy fields, the EU develops a policy through the interaction through those two methods of policy making.
EU foreign policy is not only multifaceted and multi-method, but it is also multi-level in nature. The multi-level nature of EU foreign policy reflects the interconnectedness of multiple levels of governance, including the national level, the European level, and also a more global, multilateral, international level. As it is the case in many in many policy fields of the European Union, EU foreign policy is shaped through the interaction between what happens at the national level and at the European level. But EU foreign policy is also embedded within a wider set of multilateral settings, including NATO, the WTO, United Nations, IMF, but also more informal settings like the G7 or the G20. And member states often prefer to conduct their foreign policy within one of those other multilateral settings and not through the EU. So in that sense, it's important to understand that the EU is not the only, and in many cases, not the main forum or venue for member states to conduct their foreign policies. Or member states might also give priorities to conduct national foreign policies and thus to sideline the EU. So by emphasizing the multi-level nature of EU foreign policy, we aim to avoid in this book the pitfall of too much EU-centrism.
In this video, we focused on one dimension of the first chapter of our book, the complex nature of EU foreign policy. But we also discussed some other themes. For instance, the major importance between national foreign policies of the member states, differences in terms of power of member states, their interests, their identity, their worldviews, because these differences do also shape the ultimate policies that the EU can develop. We also focus on, for instance, a set of areas of tensions that continuously can be seen in European foreign policy making. For instance, the area of tension between Atlantic solidarity and European integration, or between the EU as a civilian power or the EU as a potential military power. And finally, in that first chapter, we also explain one of the main conceptualizations that we use in our book, and that is the difference between the relational foreign policy and structural foreign policy. And relational foreign policy is mainly focused on shaping relations between the EU and other countries, regions in the world, or shaping the relations between other countries. Structural foreign policy aims to develop and influence in the long term the rules of the game that are used in relations between other countries in the world, and that can be focused on economic relations, political relations, judicial relations, social relations. And as we see in several chapters of our book, on paper, we might expect that the EU has much more capacities to develop an effective structural foreign policy, much more than a relational foreign policy. But we see that also structural foreign policy has been much more problematic for the EU, as we will discuss mainly in the chapters 10 and 11 of our book.